Hi, everybody. I'm Brittany Lewis, a breaking news reporter here at Forbes. Joining me now is Forbes contributor Ben Koltun. Ben, I appreciate you joining me today.
Thanks, Brittany.
As you know, since mid January, the United States hit its debt ceiling. And in a recent piece for Forbes, you posed this question: as the clock is ticking on raising the debt limit, it's not whether or not there should be panic. Rather, it's when there should be panic. Ben, should we be panicking right now?
Oh, well, it's the name of the game here in Washington, D.C. There's a saying: New York has Broadway, Los Angeles has Hollywood, Washington, D.C. has the debt ceiling. It's something that's like it was once a benign and bipartisan legislative tool meant to give the Treasury more latitude in issuing debt. But the debt ceiling today has become one of the most dramatic political flashpoints between the two parties. And so what we're seeing today is that it's many ways the debt ceiling fight isn't about debt. It's really about leverage and kind of just the political fight. So you're kind of seeing today, there's been debt limit fights in the past as early as the 1950s, but treasury markets today are more developed. The government spending is much more far reaching, and the consequences of default are much more consequential and much more dire. And so it kind of begs the question is, what's going to happen? And Republicans right now, they see this as leverage. And all Republicans are unified behind the idea of requiring some sort of concession, some sort of fiscal reforms for their vote on the debt ceiling. Meanwhile, President Biden and Democratic leaders are adamant that there should be no conditions to raising the debt ceiling. And so the name of the game here is getting 218 votes in the Republican House and 60 votes in the Democratic Senate to raise the debt ceiling. And there's no clear path right now. And so you see some people panicking, and some people are remaining calm, saying, at the end of the day, they're going to raise the debt ceiling one way or the other. And so what I say is that, it shouldn't be an if, but when you should be panicked. And in order to understand when, I think it's important to have a playbill of sorts of understanding the key players who are influencing the process, as well as the key milestones in the months ahead that will surely be kind of rough and tumble fights. I think one of the ironies here is that the two parties are more divided ideologically than ever before, but at the same time, they're very evenly split within Congress. So small margins create interesting dynamics. And so an individual lawmaker or a small kind of block of lawmakers can really have outside influence on the process. And so those idiosyncrasies can really impact how this debt ceiling fight unfolds. So I'd say I'm not panicked now, but I'm waiting for kind of certain milestones and certain key players to kind of have more influence, and whether or not they influence or whether or not those milestones are reached could increase that panic when kind of we near the X date.
You sound, dare I say, cautiously optimistic, which is a good sign. But we saw, like you said, those margins. There's slim margins in Congress right now, and this was highlighted most recently during that really nasty speaker fight between Kevin McCarthy and the GOP, that small faction of far right lawmakers. So let's start with him. How does he factor in here? Is he obviously one of the major players?
Who he is. I think there's something about the debt ceiling is that elections and political futures are not won or lost based on a vote on the debt ceiling, but for Republicans, primaries, and for McCarthy himself, his future as speaker does depend on whether he wins or loses a political fight. And the debt ceiling is seen as a political fight. Now Kevin McCarthy, he perseveres and he won the speakership, but many people are asking at what cost? There's a sense that kind of the tail is wagging the Republican dog here, where the far right holds sway over whether Kevin McCarthy, of how Kevin McCarthy kind of negotiates on the debt ceiling. And so he's insisting on some reforms. And that's something that most Republicans get behind. But the question is, what are these reforms? And there's a difference here when you kind of go underneath the surface level of just requiring fiscal reforms. And so I've mentioned that some players to watch include Representative Chip Roy, who was one of the 19 holdouts in McCarthy's race for speaker. He's insisting on returning to fiscal year 2022 spending levels. So that's about a $130 billion cut in discretionary spending. And then he's also looking at some things, quote unquote, woke government policies. So he wants to kind of go against some of this IRS spending that Democrats had in last Congress, and he wants to bolster kind of the border wall spending. And so these are things that are very much political fights that aren't necessarily connected to the debt ceiling. And it's something that Democrats are just never going to go for. At the same time, there are some more moderate Republicans that McCarthy needs to ameliorate that aren't going to necessarily go along with Chip Roy. And so I focus on some people like Representative Brian Fitzpatrick, who's the head of the co-head of the Problem Solvers Caucus, or Dave Joyce, who's the head of the Republican Governance Group, as well as Dusty Johnson, who is the head of the Main Street Coalition. These are all conservative but governance-minded Republicans who aren't willing to go along with the Chip Roys of the world and are kind of going to push back if they see any demands that Republicans have as being too far-reaching and unlikely to get kind of Democratic support. And then between all of this, balancing the left and the right of the Republican caucus, McCarthy needs to rely on some of his leadership allies. So there are people like House Ways and Means Chair Jason Smith, who is really a far-right Republican in terms of the debt ceiling, but he's part of the team as a member of leadership, and he needs to kind of sell the far right on coming to a deal. And then there's someone like Representative Patrick McHenry, who is the head of the House Financial Services Committee. And he is someone who used to be the chief deputy whip. He's well respected. He's conservative, but he's also noted that we shouldn't be playing, hard and loose with the debt ceiling. And so he's just another important voice on McCarthy's side to try to get the party united on some sort of position that isn't necessarily anathema to Democrats in negotiations. So certainly, McCarthy is taking the right steps here in meeting with Biden and saying, we should have some sort of fiscal reforms, but the hardest steps are still ahead of him in trying to cultivate a position that can unify 218 House Republicans.
He's definitely in a precarious position. We saw this in January. Essentially, that group of 20 Republicans or so held that gavel hostage from him. So is he beholden to this group? And if so, will he have a tougher time negotiating with Democrats when the time comes?
Yeah, that's kind of the challenge for McCarthy, is that one of his concessions in becoming Speaker was this thing called the motion to vacate, which is just a legislative tool for a member of Congress to seek a vote to oust the Speaker. And he allowed for this motion to vacate to return with just one vote. And so, again, it's as much about optics and politics as it is about kind of the debt. If some of these far-right members feel like McCarthy is giving away their leverage on the debt ceiling for some sort of fig leaf reforms, and they're not happy with that, they could seek a motion to vacate. And they've said as much, and Chip Roy has said as much, that if he's unsatisfied with some of the negotiations, McCarthy's job could be at risk. And McCarthy, his ambition was to be Speaker, and here he is. But with such thin margins, he is in a precarious position, as you noted, that if he kind of seeks too much of a negotiation among a Republican Party that's intent on fighting, it's much different than Democrats. The Republican voters are more interested in fighting, even if that risks a default, compared to Democrats who are more interested in compromise. Then he could be at risk from his right flank. But at the same time, if he moves too far from the right, that then kind of alienates a few of the moderate Republicans who are left in the conference. And that could push some of them to do something called like a discharge petition, which goes around Republican leadership if they work with Democrats. And so it's kind of between a rock and a hard place right now. And so the goal over the coming months is to try to find some sort of unified position and try to sell that to both the right and the left flanks of the Republican Party as a good position and as a win if they can get some of these concessions, even if it's not as much as Republicans, the far right Republicans, are hoping to get.
One top Republican we have yet to mention is Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell. It seems like he's almost, hanging back, letting this play out with Kevin McCarthy. Where is he in terms of these negotiations?
So McConnell, he is no stranger to kind of debt ceiling negotiations. He was the one who worked with then Vice President Joe Biden in 2011 to kind of come up with an out on the debt ceiling, and he's negotiated before. But McConnell, he doesn't need to prove his leadership bona fides, unlike McCarthy. And as he's noted, something that passes the Senate, the Democratic-controlled Senate, doesn't necessarily have the votes to pass the House. So he's strategically staying in the background. He is letting McCarthy kind of take the lead here in the first round of negotiations. He's supporting him, and many Senate Republicans are supporting the position that McCarthy has. But if McCarthy and Biden, or McCarthy or Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, are able to reach a deal then you'll start to see McConnell stick his oar in the water. McConnell is very much a fiscal conservative. He is intent on seeing some sort of cuts to spending. Count him as someone who's probably in favor of entitlement reforms, but he's also not in favor of default. He's made that crystal clear that the country will not default. And so if it comes to kind of the end stages and we're nearing the X date and McCarthy can't reach a deal, expect that the McConnell will be a bit more active and a bit more vocal in trying to reach a deal. And even if he does try to reach a deal, he's still going to try to drive a hard bargain here. And it requires some sort of concessions from Democrats. But if he gets involved in the deal, there's some sense that you can believe that he can bring at least 9 Republicans along in the Senate that can overcome the filibuster. And if something then passes in the Senate, then there's some thought that if it's at least closer to the X date and there's real panic, that there's some way to get something through the House.
What would these concessions look like if push comes to shove and McConnell comes to negotiate? What would that look like?
Yeah, so it's the country and Republicans and Democrats are much different than a decade ago, or more than a decade ago, when in 2011 there was a lot of negotiations over spending cuts of some sort of entitlement reforms. This day and age, you see Republicans a bit more populist, and that you saw former President Donald Trump and some populist Republicans saying, no, we're not going to cut entitlement spending. We're not going to cut Social Security. We're not going to cut Medicare. These are some of the biggest drivers of debt. So they're more focused on kind of discretionary spending, but even that is limited. And so Democrats from a decade ago are just less willing to negotiate. And so they've learned that negotiating did not result in anything beneficial for them politically, and it just kind of hampered government spending for kind of the following decade. So what could come out of negotiations this time? It's very much kind of a lot of fig leaf options. And what I mean by that is that something like a bipartisan commission. There's something introduced by Mitt Romney and several Democrats in the Senate, as well as in representatives in the House, of something called the Trust Act, which would create bipartisan committees to look at some of these trust funds and this entitlement spending, looking to kind of create solvency for these programs over the long term. And that's the thing with entitlement reforms. You can't do this partisan. You have to do this bipartisan, so they have sign on for both people. But a blue ribbon committee or bipartisan committee usually doesn't necessarily result in action, but it kind of punts the issue to a committee. So that's one option. Another option is some piecemeal or some very focused spending cuts. So we've seen some Republicans talk about rescinding unspent and unobligated COVID aid from the pandemic. There's been trillions and trillions of dollars spent during the pandemic, and there's about $150 billion that's been unspent and unobligated. And so that could be a little pool of money that could be rescinded and say, okay, that's some sort of deficit reduction. And then what Republicans are looking for is some sort of spending caps deal. And that means just on discretionary spending, limiting kind of the growth in spending for the next 2 years. Now, they're saying they want to limit discretionary spending, but a lot of Republicans are against a decrease in defense spending, especially with a more hawkish view towards China and with the kind of the war in Ukraine and the concerns about Russia. And so there may be some avenue for lowering spending or some very targeted spending on the discretionary side, but it's nothing that's going to really make a dent in the trajectory of debt. And so I think these are all options that are on the table, that nothing that would necessarily satisfy the far right, but it's not about satisfying them today. It's about kind of negotiations ongoing in the future and being able to declare victory that they got some sort of concession out of the debt ceiling.
Before we talk about those future dates, I do want to talk about, who has the most leverage here, because when you're talking about major players, the majority of people you named are members of the GOP. So who has the most power? Who has the most leverage? Because it sounds like the GOP is on the offense and Democrats are playing defense.
Yeah, it's a question of who has the most leverage is who's willing to let the government default. I mean, if Republicans aren't willing to let the country default, then their leverage is limited. If Democrats aren't letting the country to default, then their leverage is limited. The problem here is that a lot of politicians take their cues from voters, and voters, they don't really understand the debt ceiling, and they frankly don't really care about the debt ceiling, but they do care about the ramifications of what happens if we default on the debt. And in many ways, that harms Democrats, because Joe Biden, for better or for worse, he is seen as the one who is kind of blamed or exalted for the economy. And if there is a default, that's a pretty catastrophic situation for the American economy. And who are voters going to blame? I mean, there may be some divide over kind of Republicans and Democrats, but at the end of the day, Joe Biden is president. And it's a very hard position for him, if he's planning to run for reelection, to deal with an economy that's maybe potentially in a recession, higher unemployment rates. That the last president, the last incumbent to win reelection when there was a recession right before his reelection, was over 100 years ago. And that was President McKinley. And so I think in that sense, Republicans do have a bit more leverage here. Now, leverage is limited. That if Republicans are asking for the moon on something like the debt ceiling, I think then they can kind of that negotiations can backfire. But if they're looking for something targeted, or if they kind of find a way to declare victory on some targeted reforms, then I think then they're in a better position than Democrats. But if they kind of backfire and they overshoot, then I think that Democrats have an opening here. You're already seeing them fundraise off of kind of Republican so-called extremism. And if we're kind of in the midst of this debt ceiling fight, and we're kind of almost entering a recession later in the year, I think there's a position for Biden to pin some of the blame of the recession on Republicans and Republican extremism, which is kind of a trope that he's trying to make for his reelection. So there's a balancing act here. I mean, I think there's risks for both parties. And right now, Republicans have a little more leverage in negotiating, but as time goes on and as kind of they struggle perhaps to kind of come up with a negotiating position, I think their leverage decreases and Democrats can kind of feel a little more emboldened.
This isn't President Biden's, first rodeo when it comes to debt ceiling debates. What type of negotiator was he in his last debates in 2011, 2013, and in 2021?
Yeah, as you mentioned, President Biden has been around the block a few times. He's almost the same age as the debt limit itself. The first debt limit increase was in 1939. Biden was born in 1942. And he's very much an institutionalist. His whole belief and his whole case for being president is that he wants to show that small d democratic government can work. And so he's been in Washington, D.C. for a half a century. And so he's cultivated a lot of relationships, and he believes in the power of the Senate and kind of working together. And so in 2011, he was deployed by the Obama administration to work with then Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell to kind of reach a deal after other avenues of negotiations did not prove fruitful. And I think the takeaway from a lot of Democrats was that Biden gave away too much to McConnell. And they said, he gave away kind of some spending cuts, some sequestration, and other items that they wish that he didn't relent on. And so I think that it's a lesson for Biden and some of his close advisors and some of Democratic leaders that they don't want to go through that process again. But at heart, Biden is a negotiator. And you saw him earlier this year go to an event in Kentucky on infrastructure, and McConnell was there. That he kind of, the lines of communication, even if it's not publicly stated, the lines of communication are still open to try to reach a deal. And so as kind of this debt ceiling impasse progresses, expect those private lines of communication to remain open, and that he's still looking for a deal at the end of the day.
I do want to pivot now to some key dates in the future. What should we be looking out for next?
Yeah. So I mean, tomorrow is the State of the Union. It's a moment that's tens of millions of people tune in and see what President Biden says where the country has gone and where it's going to head. And so I think one key thing to watch here is that, does he lay out a picture of the debt limit or the debt ceiling that's very partisan, that's kind of contrasting him versus Republicans, or does he kind of provide an opening for negotiations? Is he a little more deferential to McCarthy? And is he more willing to kind of like not highlight the differences in hopes of seeking some sort of agreement down the line? So I think that's an important area, because a lot of this is about leverage, and a lot of this is about posturing in the debt ceiling, and how Biden kind of presents this to millions of people will be instrumental in kind of seeing how things progress in the near term. Now, beyond that, I think another date to watch is March 9th. This is when President Biden releases his fiscal year 2024 budget proposal. And here he's going to kind of give his vision of government spending for the next year, as well as for kind of the decade ahead. And he wants to kind of present some sort of contrast of what he sees as important spending versus what the concerns he has with Republicans over some spending cuts. And soon thereafter, Republicans are hoping to release their own budget, maybe in March, but potentially in April as well. And this is a very critical point for Republicans. They want to link the debt ceiling with some concessions on the budget. And so what we could see in a fiscal year 2024 budget for Republicans is laying out exactly what they envision those budget cuts to entail. And the hope then for Republicans is that they could have a vote on their budget. And if they can get 218 votes, that's really a bolster for Kevin McCarthy that says, like, you know what, I'm negotiating here and I can present 218 votes to pass some sort of increase in the debt ceiling with these sorts of spending cuts. But if he isn't able to, and if Republicans aren't able to pass their budget through the House, then it's a signal that McCarthy really doesn't have the votes to negotiate. And then you're going to look at some maybe alternative options here from Democrats, like a discharge petition. Another time to watch is in April 18th, which is tax day. A lot of people are unsure when the X date will happen, but we'll get a better picture of the X date when kind of tax returns come in and get a better sense of kind of the receipts incoming to the Treasury. And if it's kind of a weaker than expected receipt, then the X date could come sooner rather than later. And that's important for what I mentioned was the discharge petition, which is this maneuver to bypass House leadership and pass something on the Senate floor with just 218 votes. But it's a very complicated process. It takes about 3 months. And if the X date comes sooner rather than later, then they need to start the discharge petition perhaps as soon as March. And if the X date comes soon and they don't have the discharge petition started, then that stops one avenue for increasing the debt ceiling. And so these are kind of the dates in the near term. I also kind of even look further beyond the X date. For all the talk about the X date, whether it's going to be June, July, or August, there's a good chance that Congress could have a short-term suspension of the debt limits until the fall. And that's in a way for Republicans that would line up in potential default with kind of the start of FY24, which begins on October 1st. And so October 1st is when the new fiscal year begins, and that could be a time where there's actually further negotiations on the debt limit. And it could also be coming at a time when there's potentially a recession and when the presidential election, the Republican primary at least, is up and running. And so I think that's another date to watch in terms of how the timing can play out for this debt limit crisis.
We're in February right now. This could potentially, drag out till October. We have a long road ahead of us here. And something that you said earlier that stuck out to me is, the debt limit negotiations is kind of a boring subject to a lot of people until, they don't reach a consensus, and then there's ramifications that we all as Americans have to face. What would happen if they don't reach an agreement?
Well, if they don't reach an agreement legislatively, there is, options for taking executive action. So there's things that have been presented, like minting a platinum coin that's worth kind of trillions of dollars. There's things like prioritizing debt payment, so focusing on paying interest on debt rather than other kind of government spending. And there's areas like invoking the 14th Amendment, saying the debt ceiling is illegal and that the Treasury will still continue to pay its debts. These are executive actions that have been dismissed by Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen in the White House right now. But if we're really up against it, I think a lot of these options will come back on the table. But once we get to that point where it really is starting to panic, you'll start to see markets certainly have a reaction, and that can sometimes goad to negotiations, as we saw way back when with kind of TARP and when there was a big market reaction when Congress couldn't pass the triple asset relief program. But if that doesn't work, if executive action is on the table and then there's actually a default, the first real default in American history, I'd say that you'd expect a pretty catastrophic reaction from markets. There's been some estimates of that, we go into recession, that unemployment would spike, and it would come at a very inopportune time for President Joe Biden and Democrats as he's trying to convince the country that America is on the right track after a pandemic and after very high inflation. And this would just be a kind of almost a nail in the coffin for the economy and for really just Washington, D.C. in general and how it operates. And I think it's then you're starting to see voters kind of really look for a different change in D.C. and looking for someone from the outside, potentially even like a Florida governor, Ron DeSantis, as someone who's just looking to change D.C. if they can't get their act together and pass the debt ceiling.
The ramifications, if it's not passed, certainly do sound catastrophic, and we do have a long road ahead of us. So I hope you come back and give us your insights as we continue down. Ben Koltun, thank you so much.
Thank you.